If you're doubting your faith and you're trying to pray but it feels pointless, this video is for you. About 7 years ago, I was praying the most intense prayers of my life because I was in a really bad spot. I was unemployed and depressed and hopeless. And every day I was begging God to help until one night I just kind of snapped and I was alone in my apartment and I was yelling at God to do something. And I still felt like I got no answer. In moments of doubt or pain, it can seem like prayer doesn't make a difference. And it only feels worse when Christians are like, keep praying, it'll get better, I promise, for I know the plans I have. In this video, I want to speak as someone who's been there. Let me tell you more of my story and why I still believe prayer really does change things.
Cicero once said, "We do not pray to Jupiter to make us good, but to give us material benefits." And to that attitude toward prayer, I would say, and this is my own unique and original insight, God is not a vending machine.
God is not a vending machine.
Vending machine.
Vending machine.
Okay, apparently this is a pretty common insight, and we're gonna go way beyond this, but I wanna use it as a springboard. With the vending machine approach, prayer is a payment that we give in order to earn a response. It's about influencing God to get what we want. And the problems with that are pretty obvious. Maybe what we want is unnecessary or unwise or just wrong, but that's not really our focus. We just want what we want. The reason vending machine prayer is so bizarre to a Christian worldview is because a perfectly good and holy and loving God is the greatest thing you could desire. And so to want things from God, but to not want God, is kind of missing the point. And so when Jesus' disciples asked him how to pray, he taught them to worship God and invite his kingdom into the world. Prayers that change our hearts to love him and trust him and join our lives with his kingdom. The point is that whether our prayers are answered how we'd like or not, prayer matters because prayer changes us. And I think that's beautiful. But you might be surprised to find out that some theologians say, sure, prayer changes you, but don't expect it to change God. Prayer does not change God, but it changes him who prays. Or if everything happens according to God's will and none of the things he wills can be changed, then prayer is in vain. Or it is not to be thought that God is properly moved or made willing by our prayers. Okay, we're going to talk about all that in a minute because it is confusing. But before we dive into big ideas, I want us to talk about us. When it feels like our prayers aren't being answered, it's easy to believe that our prayers don't affect God. And so we can hold on to prayer changes us as a kind of spiritual consolation prize. Will my prayers change my circumstances? I don't know, but as long as I'm changed for the better somehow, maybe it's meant to be more dynamic than that. I've got a theory that talking to God will feel like talking at God as long as we see it as one-sided, either purely about us influencing God or purely about God influencing us. Recently, a mentor defined prayer in a way that struck me. She said it like this:
prayer, which is really an attitude more than a set of words. It's a being present to the God who is present to me.
Saying it like that felt so real and alive. And so I guess I wonder if that's really possible. Can prayer be talking with God? A conversation where we're present and genuinely responding to each other? Can prayer change us and God? No, seriously, I want to know. As best I can tell, the idea that prayers don't change God is rooted in verses like Malachi 3:5. Wait for it. I am the Lord, I do not change. I mean, how could you argue with that? I mean, this is how I would argue with that. When we take a verse on its own, it might seem clear, but there are piles of scripture that show prayer moves God. Moses intercedes with God for Israel. Hannah prays for a son and God responds. Elijah prays and it doesn't rain for 3.5 years. The fact that God responds to prayer is everywhere in the Bible. When you look at the whole passage from Malachi, the one where it says God doesn't change, it goes on to say that if Israel is faithful to God, then he will pour out blessings on them. And that seems like God will change what he does depending on their actions, right? And so I think this passage is about how God's character doesn't change and how he'll keep his promises. And actually, that's an important distinction. If we accept that prayer changes God, we're not saying that it changes his moral character or the essence of his nature. And of course, it doesn't give him new information or insight, but it can move his heart and change how he interacts with creation. And so if we let the scriptures train how we think about prayer, then we'll see it as a dynamic, interactive encounter with God. But I can admit that praying to an all-knowing God feels like a paradox. Like, if God knows what will happen, no matter what I pray, then how do my prayers make a difference? Dr. J.P. Moreland tries to resolve this paradox by pointing out a crucial difference between these two statements. If God foreknows what will happen, then it must happen. And if it will happen, then God must foreknow it will happen. I know it sounds like I just said the same thing twice, but I promise they're different. I look like a madman at Starbucks trying to figure it out for myself, and we're going to try again. Basically, Dr. Moreland is saying this is how we normally think of God's foreknowledge. It's a straight line. And our choices and interactions with God don't really matter because God has already determined what we must do. We have to follow the timeline God foreknows. And this is option one. If God foreknows it will happen, then it must happen. This version obviously makes prayer look pretty pointless, but this isn't how we have to understand God's foreknowledge. And I think that's clearer when we use everyday examples. Like, I know that when offered pizza or salmon, my wife will choose the salmon.
Hello?
I have a question for you. If you had to choose and it was either pizza or salmon, which one would you choose?
Salmon?
Are you confident?
Yes.
Okay, that's all I needed. Bye. My tiny little sliver of foreknowledge doesn't erase her free choice. And just because God foreknows everything we'll freely choose doesn't take away our choice either. Foreknowledge and free choices are not incompatible. With that in mind, Dr. Moreland offers another model of God's foreknowledge that is a lot more complex. God foreknows everything that could happen, all the choices we could make, when we could pray, and how he would respond. And because God's all-knowing, he also knows what we will eventually choose. And that's what's meant by option number 2. If it will happen, then, like all possibilities, God must foreknow it will happen. In this case, God's foreknowledge doesn't lock us in. And Dr. Moreland kind of summarizes things by saying, it is not God's foreknowledge that fixes a future event. Rather, it is the fact that a future event will happen that explains what exactly God foreknows. Your free choices are what God foreknows. And so you can choose. Okay, so turns out thinking about an all-knowing God, still complicated. But just because God knows what you will pray and how he will respond and what will happen does not mean that your prayers don't make a real difference. So there have been times in my life where I felt disillusioned with prayer, but there are also some experiences where it's hard to deny that God did answer me. Let me tell you a story. Just before I moved to Scotland, I told my wife that my dream job would be to work on this channel full time, and she suggested that we ask God to provide a creative solution. To us, it seemed like I would have to be part of an organization, and we brainstormed some specific characteristics that organization would need to have. And to be completely honest, I actually wasn't feeling very hopeful, but we started to pray every day. A few weeks later, someone from a small apologetics organization in rural Ontario reached out and said that they were interested in Truth Snack. I met with them, and they told me part of what they do is help mobilize new ministries, and they were wondering about partnership. And when we talked more, it was clear that their organization had the characteristics that we had been praying about. And now, hi, I'm Matt, and Truth Snack journeys with doubting Christians towards confident faith. And so if you're currently doubting your faith, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing. I believe that was an answer to prayer. But I don't blame you if you think, maybe that was just a crazy coincidence, because I've thought that too. But William Dembski is a mathematician philosopher who argues that we can be confident an intelligent agent is at work when there are two factors present together. A very improbable event occurs in a context where that event is independently special. And you really do need both. Being approached by a total stranger and offered your dream job and an organization that serves your specific needs is incredibly improbable, but improbable things happen every day. The specific prayers that we were praying created a context in which that specific event was independently special from everything else that could have happened. It was honestly like I said to myself, I want a large pizza with ham and hot sauce, and 40 minutes later, one showed up at my door. You have to wonder, was that just an amazing coincidence, or did someone hear what I said and do something about it? Because of the intelligent agent principle, I would be more likely to believe that someone found out what we were praying about TruthSnack and was telling organizations before believing that it was just a coincidence. In fact, I asked them that because I was skeptical that God had answered. But until the big conspiracy is revealed, I'm going to believe that was an answer to prayer.
So I want to offer you what I've learned from scripture and from reason and from experience. They've helped me believe that prayer really is a conversation with God that makes a difference. But there's one more thing I want to offer you, and it goes back to this idea that prayer is being present to the God who is present to me. When I was doubting, I'm sure people tried to tell me like everything I just said in this video. And sure, I believe it now, but I get that when it's so far from what you're living every day, it's hard to believe. And so maybe you'd be surprised or comforted that questioning God is actually a super common theme in the Psalms. People crying out, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" is actually a well-documented part of our faith tradition. In my own story, what we've discussed about scripture and reason and experience were like seeds of hope. It wasn't that how I felt about prayer suddenly changed, but my frustrated encounters with God were the soil out of which faith grew. And so if the only prayer you can sincerely say right now is, "Why, Lord, do you stand far off? Why do you hide yourself in times of trouble?" keep praying it. Jesus is willing to meet you there.